Welcome to Data Security Decoded from Rubrik Zero Labs. I'm your guest host, Caleb Tolan, and today we're bringing you something a little different. We're excited to kick off a series of special episodes featuring highlights from the recent Rubrik Zero Labs Virtual Summit. This series offers a unique look into critical conversations happening around data security. Steve Stone's taking on a different role in these special episodes, and instead of guiding us through our usual discussions, he'll be leading in-depth conversations with industry experts. In this first special episode, we're focusing on data security in healthcare. Steve sits down with Rick Bryant, Rubrik's healthcare CTO, who brings over 3 decades of experience in healthcare technology to the table. They'll be unpacking some eye-opening findings from our latest report, discussing unique challenges faced by healthcare organizations in securing sensitive data, and exploring the very real impacts of cyber attacks on patient care. You'll hear about the rapid growth of healthcare data, common misconceptions in the industry, and strategies to bolster your cyber resilience. So let's join Steve and Rick as they dive in. Enjoy.
You know, Rick, we definitely want to talk about the report and its focus on healthcare. But before we do, I'd really kind of like to start with your deep experience in healthcare. You've spent years focused on healthcare. You speak with a range of industry experts on both sides of the fence when it comes to cybersecurity for healthcare and what healthcare needs. And I would love to kind of hear what are some of the misconceptions you run into, or if I put that a little bit different way, if you could change one common belief about healthcare and data security, what would that be, Rick?
Well, Steve, thank you so much for having me. I'm a huge fan of the Zero Labs work that you're doing, and I'm very appreciative of the specific information that you're giving healthcare because I truly believe it's needed. We have an industry that's critical, that's under assault right now. And so the information that you're providing is giving everybody a better information to better protect their organization and to build a business case, which is very important to be able to achieve that. Regarding healthcare, I've been in healthcare industry and technology roles for security and infrastructure leadership for over 30 years. And I think the biggest misconception is everybody looks at a healthcare organization and they think of it as a pristine tower of safety, of security, of patient care. And there's definitely a focus on patient care, but it's a large organization and it has many different vulnerabilities in it. You mentioned how healthcare data is growing faster than any other else. That's something that's on pace and it makes sense. You think about the world that we live in, there's all kinds of vaccine data and wearables and all kinds of health interactions that are happening on a regular basis. And the providers are capturing that information and leveraging that information. The key is that they have to secure that information. And one thing that I've seen over the years is that, and I've spoken to this on many different points, in that healthcare has a very high value information, as your report states, more than 20% sensitive over any other industry. And yet they have a relatively low investment in security. And when I say a low investment in security, typically IT organizations have an investment of 3 to 5% in their IT security. Whereas when I look at other industries like financial services, for example, they invest 10 to 15%. Now that is increasing and improving since the attacks starting, ramping up 2019 with ransomware, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done there. And that also the patients themselves have the accountability and they're looking for the healthcare institutions to be able to protect that data. And so it's really critical to maintain the trust. Healthcare operates on trust.
I think that's, really well said. And a lot of what you're talking about, we started running across, so we don't have the 30 years of experience you do, but in our deep dive on healthcare that we did, we ran into several of the same things. And I think it's interesting. You mentioned you can't read the news right now and not read about healthcare, ransomware, and those impacts. And we were asked quite a bit since we released the report, is that why we focused on healthcare? And honestly, we focused on healthcare for 2 reasons in this report. We didn't know what the outcomes were going to be, right? You don't know the research until it's done. But we chose healthcare first because we saw a real focus around sensitive data being a critical issue, and that being subject to more regulatory scrutiny than we see in a lot of other industries. Not unique, there's others, but there's some really interesting regulatory pressures that we wanted to understand. And the second part, as a peer researcher, all that regulatory pressure creates publicly available data, which is more information that we can study. And so as we looked at that, one of the things that we ended up running across, and I'd love to kind of get your thoughts around this, is what we saw was, and I think it's very much, I'll kind of steal your own lines here, what you were just talking about, the way healthcare is thinking about data and data protection really feels like it's shifting dramatically. I would bet if we did the same research 2 years from now, we'd have some different outcomes. But in your experience, how do healthcare organizations, kind of top to bottom, how do they think about data and data protection? And then do you think that worldview is different from other industries like financial services that you mentioned?
I do think it's very different. Every industry has its nuances, but healthcare is not really motivated by cost savings and revenue generation the way that other industries are. If you work at the financial organization, they can really tell you the cost of downtime and the cost of a breach, right? It's a mathematic formula for there. Whereas in healthcare, our primary drive is to take care of the patient and patient care. So I think the report brings some great information to light there. Similarly, I think in healthcare organizations, we all talk about the electronic medical record, and that's really critical, but it's just one system that culminates a lot of critical information. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of auxiliary systems up to and including email and text that have PHI in it that also must be protected. So I think the perception in IT and technology and healthcare is that if we protect the EMR, we're protecting the data. When in reality, they have to find and know where all their PHI is and properly protect it at all places and at all times per HIPAA.
Yeah, and I think that focus around PHI and everywhere it lives is so critical. I mean, one of the things that, as we've released this report and we've been speaking about a lot, I think probably top three things that we talk about is, what's different? What makes healthcare different? And it all comes down to this sensitive data aspect. And you mentioned at the top of this discussion, typical healthcare organization's about 20% larger data-wise than the global average. That's a little interesting. It's growing a little bit faster, total volume, 27% compared to 23% globally. It's a little interesting. But then when you dive into that PHI, that sensitive data, that regulated data, everything changes. Healthcare has 50% more sensitive data than a global average. And what really caught me was that sensitive data is growing at more than 63% in a year, far surpassing any other industry and about 5 times the global average, which is, off the top of my head, is around 13, 14%. So, and again, I'm sure these numbers don't surprise you as someone that's been in these, but I'd ask you kind of a two-part question. Do you think we got that right? Does that sensitive data growing at 5 times the global average feel right to you? I know feel is always dangerous in cybersecurity. And then, if that number feels about right to you, what should we take away from that? Is that going to consist? Is that going to go down? What do you think that's going to mean a year, 5 years from now?
Fantastic question. Steve, I would say that nobody's really surprised that we create more data than anybody else. If you look at all the IoTs, Health Watch, all the interactions we're having with our clinicians, and actually the drive to be proactive about patient care, I think healthcare is going to continue to drive more information than any other industry because of that. And we know that almost everything we deal with is sensitive. It's PHI, it's protected healthcare information. The piece that really got my attention, and I think everybody on this webinar needs to know, is that a healthcare organization will have a 50% larger impact due to a cyber event than any other industry. And in my mind, that's something that needs to go into the business case to justify better security for patients to be able to minimize or offset that 50% larger impact. That's a board level discussion. Healthcare organizations need to be having this conversation with their board to justify higher levels of security. And also, I think that another piece of the report that was very interesting to me, and this is something that's very challenging in the industry, is that 1/3 of all Americans have had their healthcare data compromised. And what I see from the downstream effects of that is that the patients themselves, us, my children, your children, they're no longer counting on the healthcare organizations to be able to protect the data. And you're starting to see backlash from that in more class action suits. They're saying the regulations are there. You guys aren't doing the fiduciary responsibility. We're going to hold you accountable to a higher level than even Health and Human Services would, or the OCR that enforces it. Another piece that I think is very interesting from this data set is that when you look at the impact of an individual medical record, it can be used from everything from pharmaceutical theft to identity theft. And if you look at a children's hospital, for example, they could be subject to that identity theft for 80, 90 years. That's a serious concern. We need to protect that data better.
It's interesting you mentioned that kind of 1 out of 3 American statistic. It's whenever we do these research events, you go through it, you try not to have your preconceived notions, but you always do. And then you look at all the data and you say something's not right on this one. Let's go back and relook it. And that 1 out of 3 American stat, I'll be really upfront with the audience. We actually went back and reran that multiple times because that number just sounds too high. Like looking at that HHS OCR data, it did say that, about 1 out of 3 Americans had their personal data compromised in just intrusions against healthcare in just the US in just 2023. We actually reran that data 3 times. I actually went to some of my old peer research of the other organizations, said, double check my work, because this doesn't seem, it seems really high. If you extrapolate that out to other intrusions and that just starts really painting a dire picture. So I know we're kind of moving a little bit out of the cybersecurity realm, but let's just take that piece. 1 out of 3 Americans lost their personal data in just the US against just healthcare targeting last year. What are we supposed to take away from that reality? What do we do moving forward with that being the frame that we're operating inside of?
Well, there's several aspects to that, right? I think the biggest takeaway is that we need to take healthcare security much more seriously, right? We need to get that trust back from our patients that my data will be safe with you. Also, within the framework of HIPAA and ultimately HIPAA Omnibus, which is the wrap all around it rule, is that OCR now looks at organizations and rates them based on the severity of the extent of the breach. So, for example, good guys doing everything that they should be will still suffer a breach, but they'll get less fines and less impact than what they call willful neglect, organizations that know that they have a vulnerability and then consciously choose not to fix it. So we need to consciously look for those vulnerabilities. We need to consciously do everything within our effort and within an ecosystem. This is part of all of our jobs to protect this patient care information. We're proud to be a partner in the data protection and data resiliency, but there's several other aspects that need to be done. We have to take this seriously and move this industry forward. And at Rubrik, we have made a commitment to help healthcare. We want to be the de facto standard to protect and make that data resilient.
So I like to kind of shift gears to a different part of the report. One of the areas I was actually really excited to talk to you about because of your 3 decades working in healthcare. One of the really interesting parts for me as a cybersecurity person with this research was working with the University of Minnesota Twin Cities School of Public Health. Their research around patient care impact and ransomware was, we just found it was really powerful and really augmented this discussion. This is why we're doing all the ones and zeros and data security. And without walking through all their research, but their discussions around something like 1 out of 4 hospitals are being affected by this, either as direct victims or ripple impacts. There's the big headline that catches all the attention of, they assess there's between 47 to 62 patients who have died as a direct result of ransomware. There's discussions around hospital lose 20% of their patient care capability once a ransomware impact hits, and that lasts for at least a week. So talking with them about how healthcare thinks about those patient care impacts, it really highlighted something that we talked to their researchers. They spoke very openly about, and again, they weren't coming from this from a cybersecurity angle. They saw a real dichotomy between how cybersecurity professionals and healthcare think about cybersecurity, and then how healthcare writ large thinks about cybersecurity. And those perceptions don't align. So I'd be really interested in your perspective there, in your experience. How does cybersecurity think about healthcare, and how does healthcare think about cybersecurity, and what do we need to do there?
I think that's the most powerful point in the report, and I commend you on having the strength and audacity to bring this point up, because this is the ugly reality that people don't want to talk about, especially if you're within healthcare. I myself, over the years, have been through 3 different cyber breaches. One of them is zero-day vulnerability. And I can tell you firsthand that there is patient care impact to that. Now, the reason this is important is because, as mentioned earlier, the primary driver for healthcare is around patient safety, patient outcomes, in the Hippocratic Oath. First of all, do no harm, right? And when you can tie the adverse effects, we call them sentinel events or patient deaths, due to a ransomware or a cyber event, you're talking to the heart of the organization. You're talking to the chief medical officer. You're talking to the CEO. You're talking to everybody that works within that organization. They want to go there and help people. They don't want to go there and not have access to a blood type and mismatch or allergies and cause a sentinel event. I think that this is something that's really going to alter the industry. I think they're going to take this to heart and they're going to put these pressures and they're going to put these measures in place to properly protect this data because it will impact patient outcomes. And I think that if we don't do this as an industry, it's going to have downstream effects. We saw the effects of nursing burnout with COVID, for example. Now, if you're a doctor in a highly litigious society or a nurse, a caregiver, how likely are you wanting to go into an organization that you know is under a ransomware attack and your patients are going to be at risk? That's going to have long-term impacts. So it's a responsibility of these organizations to protect these patients by protecting these data and protecting this critical organization and the allergies, the blood types, those type of things. In fact, this is written in canon. This has been law since 1996. Healthcare is one of 3 organizations that defined as critical infrastructure that has to be up at all times. The first is police for civil disorder. The second is fire for property disorder. And the third is in healthcare. You can't think of any critical event where healthcare is not intended to be up at all times. And they have regulations around this. They need to work with their partner ecosystem to be able to protect against this new front attack and work with their partner ecosystems to make sure that they're resilient.
Well, Rick, I can ask you questions all day long. I got time for about one more. And I'd kind of like to circle back. You made a comment at the very beginning around healthcare and financial services. And one thing I've seen in my own career is each industry really has something to inform the others. I think if you want to really understand segmentation and prioritization of environments, ICS leads the way. You mentioned financial services and understanding real cost of intrusions and investments. Financial services leads all industries in those areas, in my own experience. I'd be curious from your experience, where does healthcare lead? What can healthcare inform other industries and really help benefit from these experiences?
I think healthcare really, because of the qualitative and quantitative amount of data, they're able to leverage that data to create better outcomes. And these are better outcomes for you and me. If you look at the intent of the the Affordable Care Act or accountable care organizations, it's to lower the cost of healthcare by improving the outcomes. We spend more money on healthcare in this country than most other countries. And to put that into perspective, it's about 16 to 17% of our gross domestic product. The entire armed forces only have a budget of 4. It costs us 4 to 5 times more to keep Americans healthy than it does to protect the entire world. We need to take that responsibility seriously and use that information to be able to come up with better clinical outcomes and lower the cost of healthcare. So all of this is really critical to them being able to drive differentiated outcomes. And you look at the power of AI, I'm very skeptical about that in terms of direct medical intervention, but in terms of preventing safety mistakes, coming up with good, fair inferences based on data, the data always should drive the decision, right? And you created some great data for us to take action on.
Well, I appreciate it, Rick. And thanks again for joining us. Your expertise has been great. I really appreciate your time here today, Rick.
It's been a blast. Thank you so much, Steve.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Data Security Decoded. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you're notified about new episodes. Leave us a review or a comment to let us know what you enjoyed most about this episode. For more information about measuring your data's risk, check out the resources from Rubrik Zero Labs in the show notes. See you next time.